When people come to you with performance anxiety problems, do you deal with it that way?
Well, no, with performance anxiety, I start out, most of all, I insist, of course, that they know their subject.
Yeah, well, we assume that's a given, all right.
But then the emotional states, the audition stress syndrome and everything that goes with that, I immediately give them the slow breathing. In other words, if you examine a person who's under this type of excitement, and fear, because what it is, it's a sensing of danger.
Sure.
And immediately you'll find a very high pulse rate, that the pulse is moving up faster, and the breathing becomes shallow and rapid. And so we go to the psychosomatic aspect and start to reverse with the body rather than the mind. I start to calm the body down by, instead of short, shallow breaths, long, slow breaths, so there's no hyperventilation. Put breathing into a specific count, 5 or 6 seconds in, 5 or 6 seconds, but full breaths. And after 3 or 4 breaths like that, you take the pulse again, you'll find it's slowing up. And then, of course, all of the other aspects of your body associated with this phenomena begin to go back to their norms. This is one way of establishing a very good control. Then the mentalizations. In other words, again, if instead of an instrumental type of problem, if you can just sense the communication, if you know the message, then you begin to think of the message and how do you deliver it to the persons who are going to receive it, rather than are they going to like me, what do they think of me, what if this goes wrong or that goes wrong, If we would start to remove the danger and let the person become the teacher.
So the importance of the message then overshadows the person.
Even in their practice, you set up a challenge with a mirror and a tape recorder where they are actually looking in that mirror and playing to somebody else at that time. Rather than asking a question, they're issuing a statement. And then they ask the question when they play the tape back afterward. Right, immediately this begins to push them into a much more, what would I say, positive frame of a communicator.
Of looking at the whole process of communicating.
Exactly. And I usually teach these messages in short phrases with many repetitions, so we avoid the fatigue factors, because as soon as something feels wrong, that's a signal for the brain, like a Mars light on a police car, to start rotating, find out what's the danger, what's wrong, what can I do to fix it, You have to stay away from that. You have to be able to even lie to the people. You don't have to feel good to sound good,
It says Ta. There's a capital T and a small a. I always write it as a small t with a capital A, where the vowel is the trombone tone. The vowel is always the tone. If you think of speech, ta, te, ti, ti, to, tu, the consonant is unvoiced. The vowel is what you're hearing. It is voiced. In other words, you don't get any air with a T at all. And if the tongue just withdraws a very slight bit of T, then you will only get a very, very small quantity of air. And so we have to make sure that we have the ability to open the airways so the air can get to the embouchure. Now, we add to this the H consonant. Do that once. Who, and gently. So it's windy. Yeah. Now, we have then a mixture of H and T together. May I have your trombone, and do you mind if I play a note? Are you healthy? I'm not. H is coming through in there. weeks. But really, when you don't worry about what it feels like, it's quite easy to play. And I could get back on this in no time. But can you hear the simplicity of this? These are blown attacks, not released. And that's exactly what you're getting, a mixture of T and H. Now, we have many attacks. That doesn't mean what he's doing is wrong. It is not wrong. It fits many musical situations. But what would help you a great deal now would be to add this to your arsenal of tools. It's fun playing a trombone. And it's much lighter than the tuba. Important stroke in the vowel-consonant relation is always the vowel that takes the tongue out of the way of the column of air. The consonant puts it in the way, the vowel takes it out of the way. You can always consider the consonant the baritone sound, the vowel the baritone sound. The consonant would be silenced. The T consonant is unvoiced. Even in speech it's unvoiced. So we want to play down and not use a capital T when you're tonguing, but a small t when you're tonguing. Precise. Precise as can be, yes, but not with a power track.
What about the notion of this quiet moment where you have to listen?
Recall is extremely important.
Yeah.
In other words, we have memory, we have short-term, we have long-term memory. Many subjects, excuse me, the message will go in, you'll receive it, and it'll be cast out by the brain because you've already got the message and it's of there's very little meaning to the person receiving it. In other words, if you're standing in the street and a huge truck is bearing down on you and it makes a blast of a horn and he's fairly close and you jump out of the way, barely escaping with your life, you're going to remember that all your life. You've got a neural pathway established that's going to be there as long as you're alive. But the learning experience in something that's of a commonplace nature and so forth very quickly can leave. Now here we're challenging people who are in a new subject.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've had people who were tone deaf. I mean, to the extent that at that period in our time they were thought to be tone deaf. I never agreed with it, but that's what was happening at the time that I started this program. Mm-hmm. And I started to study this. That's when I really went into the brain activity a great deal. Mm-hmm. And I found there's a couple of boys today that are working with orchestras, making a fine living, who they would qualify as tone deaf because they could not respond to a note. If I asked them to sing it, they could not do it. They couldn't even come close.
Oh my.
Yeah. And we would start a program where we would bring in the multiplicity of senses right away, the sense of sight, the sense of sound, where possible, even feel, and so forth. But always basic to this was a sound source followed by silence. The period of silence is to establish recall. Now this, like any other skill, this begins to develop as an ability, and at first it's not really there.
Yeah.
And many times, even when it's in their head, they can't signal with their vocal cords because as soon as they want to sing, they immediately try to take charge of the muscular region, and the message goes right out the brain. They think it's there, but it's not. They have no message at the time they're trying to get the vibratory rate started up in their mechanisms. So we immediately begin to counter this with the use of words, use of message, so that it becomes from the person we're working with to his audience. We always put them in, because to influence the external environment, you must use motor systems.
Yeah.
You use sensory systems to acquire knowledge, but you use motor systems to impart knowledge. These people are using sensory systems to try to impart it. They're setting up mechanisms in the region of the throat and how to do rather than how to sound. So I found that it was very productive to work where they had these periods of silence where they could train the brain into recalling the sounds, to be able to think musical messages in silence. These people have never done that. You'd think this would be commonplace because most of us do it without any encouragement from anybody. But some people, they might be marvelous in math, they might be marvelous in logic, but they just have not developed as a child around the sound. In other words, around music and so forth. I grew up where we had a great deal of music in our family and was exposed to it from the time I was born, actually, probably prenatal as well, but always music. And so the ability to recognize sound and to rehear, not in silence in my head, to hear all of this was very, very great in me, as long as I can remember. I took it for granted that everybody had that. But in questioning varieties of people, I found that there are people that this is very far from their abilities, So we start where a person can begin to acquire knowledge, not from a level that he cannot cope with. Very important that if he can't run, you start where he walks. If he can't walk, you start where he can crawl. And in the cases I would be doing, I would start with single notes. I'd question him and find out if anything from school stayed in the brain of the person. In other words, any like this anthem or anything like that. Usually there was some piece buried somewhere where there were a few notes that would stay in tune. And that's why I suspected we had something to work with. It turned out that I was right, that we did have something to work with, and immediately the growth would start. And I would use a tape recorder. These were first coming out at that time. They were first coming on scene, the old ones. And a piano. And I wouldn't bother with their instrument in this particular training, but just make it a simple little thing where we play one note, and he would have to indicate recognition and ability of recall, and either through humming or whistling, or if necessary, playing it on the tuba, fishing it out, But very quickly that ability would grow.
Do you think it's because many teachers concentrate so much on the repetitive aspect of the technique? If you're not getting it, like this young man, if you're not getting it, well, you just got to do it over and over again. And you don't think about it, but you just, at random, without thinking, without letting it recall, you just practice the technique, and it never
This is
gets
one
better.
way, and as I say, it's the least productive because eventually, if the repetition, it'll start to form a neural pathway. It'll start to come, but
It takes longer,
it's so much
doesn't it?
longer.
Yes.
It's much better, if you simply play the notes, but very slow. And again, one by one, establish the pitches in your brain and just take them out of context and find what pitch you're playing, but so that you can recall it. It's very important because when we play, we cannot play by phrase. This is the strange thing. You singers don't have to worry about this so much because you're using a variety of words. And usually this protects you because you'll find each word provides its own stimuli.
Unfortunately, though, so many times you hear the same stress on every syllable just as unmusically as you're playing one note on a piano at
Sure.
a time,
Well, on the brass instrument, they start to play by blowing and fingering. And the first thing you know, they're blowing against the embouchure and they're fingering, but the brain is not sending anything out. There's no stimuli, they're hearing instead. And then the missed notes come in. These are in some advanced players even. And music, they know they're always missing a note. Now all you have to do is, just like the singer, make sure that each pitch has its own stimulus. Now with words you can do that.
That's true.
I love you so. If you just play da 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 da, maybe it'll slip out somewhere and then one of the notes will kind of get lost, you know. One to thee, one to thee, one to thee, one would suffice. Each one of those would have had a stimulus. It goes right down the seventh cranial nerve to the lip, and you won't have a breakdown in pitch. Now, as we learn to create phrase, so the audience hears phrase, we create the phrase, just like we would create messages out of single words, out of individual words. We can create a sentence. For instance, coming out today, I poked my nose out of the door and felt it was quite cold, and I went back and picked up my top coat. Then I thought I'd even take a hat. Now you can immediately picture me at the motel, sensing the cold and getting my top coat and my hat. That's a phrase. I had to use individual words to create that phrase. I cannot have the same aspect in producing the phrase that you had in hearing the phrase.
Course, yeah.
Now, what about these young people? They're listening all the time to records, and there's a certain imitation of the phrase. There's a certain amount of that going on, and they're thinking the phrase, they're not thinking the building of the phrase. And as a result, they're not getting the proper reflex response somewhere in that phrase. They begin to lose the response patterns. You can see that. You also get no place trying to break an old habit. If something is wrong, the first thing you do is stop fighting it. Accept it. You became probably, quite an advanced, quite a good compound player with what you had. In other words, nothing is ever wasted. You might find a use for it somewhere. But the main thing is to have the attitude that you're not going to do anything by correcting what's wrong. You have to establish what's right. That may sound like a play on words, but it is not just a play on words at all. It is just simply, it is far more efficient to stop fighting an old habit, because the more you become aware of the old habit, one part of the brain says, that's a bad habit, we've got to get rid of it. Another part of the brain that has to do with the repetitive aspect of motor function and so forth, they say, well, he's doing it again. We may as well keep it going, you know what I mean? So what you do right away is begin to ignore it, and you begin to establish a new habit to replace it with. Otherwise, it can be very frustrating, and I think I understand what you've been going through. Would you play?
I thought I'd play something that I can't get through.
Why don't you play something you can get through? So we hear go at your best. But we're going to get to the problem right away anyway.
Well, I've just been working on the things I can't get through.
She's just been working on the problems. Whatever you do not do that. That's a disastrous way to approach your instrument. Always make dominant what you can do and get better and better at what you can do, because we always sneak something good into something bad. In other words, we don't correct what's wrong nearly so much as you think, as establish what has to be right. So if you can find what you sound the best on, what people love to hear you do, and you know you do well, I would want that emphasized, or your warm-up is always based on competing with the first group in the chamber orchestra up there, or the Minneapolis orchestra, you know what I mean? I need always your search for excellence, not correctness. Everything you do as a human being that's on a repetitive basis begins to form a habit. When you play very poorly and you keep trying to correct it, but you're still playing very poorly, it gets easier and easier to play very poorly. It becomes your way of playing. One part of the brain says, I don't like this. Another part says, well, she's doing this all the time, I guess must be what she wants.
Isn't that a factor, though, that a musician will learn so much by hearing others and by conceiving? The only warning I give is don't listen so much to yourself. play for somebody else, and then listen to playbacks, or recognize you're still here yourself, but with a low percentage of your concentration. So the massive concentration, like I'm doing with you people today, is communicating. I can hear myself, but I'm not concentrating on what I sound like. I'm concentrating on very complex thoughts, because you're asking very complex questions. And if I didn't know my subject well, I would be in trouble up here. But fortunately, I do know it well. So I have no time to concentrate on laryngeal and pharyngeal and lingual, all the activities of muscles and respiration. I have to concentrate on messages. And of course, this is pretty much what happens with the instrument. You must concentrate always on talking to your audience instead of with vocal language, speech language. You do it with the musical language of your instrument. But you have to have a message for somebody else. The worst thing is to be asking questions at the moment you should be issuing statements. That's important.